Hi everyone and welcome to the Echo Chamber Club. This is a new discussion show where we say what we don't think and see if we can learn something from it. And with me today is Sam Johnston and Tobi Ayorinde, and we're talking about free speech. Should people say what they really think? And interestingly, when I posed this question both to Tobi and Sam, they both actually thought that we do have some element of self-censorship in today's society. We're not really entirely sure about whether or not that's different to before, but definitely today we do mediate what we say. So is that a good thing? And that's where we have slightly different opinions. So Tobi, would you like to state what your opinion is on the subject first? Should people say what they really think?
Yeah, I think we've already agreed that people can't. I think it's a bad thing, really, for three major reasons. Firstly, I think it's really quite ineffective. Instead of actually combating the ideology, you just make it much more difficult to detect. I think, secondly, it's quite corrosive for the people who control speech, in the sense that actually not being challenged on what you believe or why you believe it, I think leads over time to you losing track of where those beliefs are deeply rooted in. And I think that's another big problem. I think thirdly, the most obvious is that I think that society should be one whereby people can say what they think and do what they feel, and I think that those are just kind of basic liberal principles. I think that applies to people that you don't agree with or you don't want to hear from as much as it applies to yourself, which is what people defend it for.
Okay, so just to summarise those three reasons again, it's ineffective,
corrosive, and it's illiberal.
Okay, cool, great summary. Sam, would you like to say your opinion on this subject?
So I think I broadly agree that free speech is a very good thing and that it's a kind of a key element of a liberal society. I'm just not as certain that the way we have the world right now, saying what you really think in pure isolation, people aren't able to see the actual impact of that element of speech. So I think you can have people saying things which they don't really think about the long-term consequences of. And I think that ends up leading to a world whereby certain people are actually privileged to speak in ways that other people aren't. So I think that this idea that everyone is equal to say the same thing is obviously something we should be aiming for, provided everyone actually is able to say the same things. In a world with different income levels, in a world with racism, in a world with sexism, you end up with these kind of disadvantaged people who, though they theoretically have the right to say exactly what they think, aren't actually in a position to come out and say it. And so while I think that a liberal society should definitely aim for everyone should say what they really think, I think currently we live in a world where some people's opinions are already determined to be more heavily weighted than others. So if you get, say, like a rich white male saying something, he is more likely to be listened to than, say, like a poor black woman. And that means that actually you need to moderate more carefully how people in advantaged positions are able to speak versus those in disadvantage, which may be as simple as, say, giving more of a voice to people in disadvantaged positions.
Okay, interesting. So what you'd be saying is people who have privileged positions perhaps should be tempering what they say to a certain extent.
Yes, I would say that while I definitely agree that a liberal society, free speech is something to be aimed for, I would say that this should people say what they really think? Yes, but maybe we need to think more carefully about where our ability to speak comes from.
Interesting. So I think the disagreement here lies, perhaps Tobi, you sit more on an absolutist idea, which is
very absolute.
Yeah, which is everyone should be able to say what they think. Yeah. Whereas you are kind of more in the maybe not, but it's pretty difficult then to figure out where those rules might lie.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so this is then where it gets interesting. Look at you two, you're really nervous.
Yeah. So Tobi turns to bleeding heart liberal. An absolutist free speech. Yeah, it's going to be good.
Interesting though, Tobi did argue for it on liberal ground.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. We're both liberals, but different ways. Yeah.
So you're going to switch.
Yeah.
So now, Tobi, you believe that some people shouldn't say what they think, and Sam, you believe that everyone should. So the way that we're going to do this is I'll ask you both a couple of questions, and you have to answer it as if you had the other person's point of view. Okay. It could get confusing, but hopefully you'll bear with us.
Yeah, cool.
And then equally, if you have a question that perhaps you feel is perhaps the weakest part of what you say, then you can equally ask questions and take your own opinion down.
Sure.
Okay. I might start off by asking you, Sam, who is arguing.
Tobi? Yeah.
Who is Tobi?
Can't you tell?
I might start by asking you. You spoke about people saying what they think and saying what they feel. A big part of this is also hate speech, right?
Yeah.
Actions that have real harm. How does that mesh with your opinions on free speech?
I think it's probably to do with the boundary line between speech and violence. Probably. I mean, I think we already agree that there are limits on free speech up to a point. The classic, you can't shout fire in a crowded theatre. Things like child pornography is an element of an element of speech, in sense it's like a kind of work of production is like banned. So we already accept there are kind of curtailments within a very liberal free speech on what people are allowed to say. So I think it's already recognised that there are limits on free speech to that degree. So I guess for me, I would say that it's to do with how close you get to the creation of violence and actual harm to people's kind of physical beings.
Okay.
Again, sort of maybe anticipating what I hope Tobi would say. But for me, it's very much when you shout fire and cause a stampede, or you don't, then you are kind of clearly harming people. You produce child pornography that harms lots of people as well. And so I would say that once you get to the point where you're inciting violence, when you're just kind of inciting violence or kind of putting people in dangerous situations through speech, then it kind of switches over in this spectrum from speech to violence, I would say.
So basically, if you were taking that position, then you're already saying that you're not really an absolutist, right? Because you're saying that actually free speech can't occur in some circumstances.
I don't think there's anyone in this world discussion which doesn't accept that there are already limits on free speech. It's just to do with the fact how we readily recognise them. And so you can be very absolutist about what people should say, but I think it's I don't think there's any kind of version of debate where you should be able to say totally anything. So
Okay.
I think absolutism is always, when it comes to free speech, is always curtailed to some degree.
Okay.
I would say.
Tobi, do you have a follow-up question to argue against yourself?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Sorry, I don't know if that was what you would have said.
No.
Obviously, but
I think obviously there are clearly limits on exactly what you can say in certain circumstances. Why those limits are there, I guess, is maybe where we would have disagreed. For example, child pornography clearly abrogates a certain population from their rights and their freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, you don't even need to talk about free speech by saying it in order to argue against it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. I don't think that's not a question of whether your speech is free or not, because in developing that kind of thing, it does so against the rights of another group of people. That's not a free speech question. That's a kind of morality or law question.
As an adjudicator, I might have to stop you there, because you're actually arguing for your own point of view right now, which goes against the FHA Club principles and rules. So
what would I say? What would I say, Tobi?
But what is a question that you would ask Sam? What do you think is the biggest problem with your own point of view? And pose it as a question.
The biggest problem, my point of view. I think the question that I would ask you is, what do you do when some people's speech is not listened to, and how do you address that in a fair way? In a way that ensures that, yes, I think you do need to make sure that voices which aren't listened to are pushed to the forefront, but how can you do that in a fair way?
Well, obviously I would say that curtailing the speech of people who are free already, where it's not an option, because it's a fundamental right and you should be able to kind of say whatever you want.
Okay.
Again, up to this limit of violence which we've already discussed.
Yeah.
So I would say that the answer to that is not by making some people less free. Okay. It is by improving education, improving the kind of structural elements of society to where you get a position where everyone is in a position of equality, in a kind of you kind of utopian way. I don't have a clear game plan. If I did, maybe we'd be in a fairer society. I don't know, but that's what I would say. I would say that you don't achieve this by curtailing the speech of others. You do it by trying to create a fairer society from the bottom up.
It's also an interesting question, because quite a lot of people are now coming forward and making sure that they use their voices to stand up for other members of society as well. So, Anyway, good, well done.
Okay.
Was I Tobi enough?
I don't know.
Is that all right? Yeah. Okay.
Tobi, now on you. So, you've got this point of view around how, I mean, it's kind of on the back of what Sam was we were just talking about, but if you believe that there are some people who are more privileged in society and automatically have a stronger and a louder voice, and this then means that free speech doesn't have this equal playing field, how do you adapt your point, like that, because that's basically a pragmatic point, right? How would you create a society where you would know whether or not you were in a privileged position or not, right? That's a really I think that's fairly obvious. I think that because it's speaking as Sam. No, genuinely, I think that is fairly obvious. I think that if you look at the way society is structured, if you look at what voices we see on TV, if you look at who are the kinds of people that write books 5-10 years ago and beyond, it's very clear that certain groups of people are in a privileged position when it comes to speech. And so you don't need to be sure. I think everybody would know. I think it's clear when there are certain groups that aren't represented, because if you go to those groups, they don't engage in the political system, they don't engage in journalism, or they feel that they can't engage. And I think when those groups are properly represented, it will be clear to all. I don't think that. I think that it's a practical point. It's a fairly evident point. There's no. I sometimes think it's quite tricky though, and this is speaking as me, because you might have, let's say, a very privileged, like, these would be exceptions to the rules though, right? Yeah. So you'd have a very privileged black man who's been to Eton, for instance, or you might have but I know that we're kind of giving these exceptions to the rule, but I'm just because they're obvious exceptions to the rule, but there must be some that kind of live in the grey area.
Yeah, and the question you have to ask yourself is, with any plan or with any idea, who loses out? So you say to me that there might be privileged black people who get to use the banner of being not privileged because they're black, even though they went to Eton. I'd say fine, he gains from that system, but how many people like that do you know? Is that a big problem? Is that the major problem? And I would argue that that's not the major problem, actually, and that is a small injustice in otherwise would be a better system, which would be actually poor black women, for example, having proper voices in the media, proper voices in politics. And so yes, would there be situations where, you know, you could find exceptions which maybe people weren't happy with? Yes, but that's not the major issue, is it? Is what I would say if I was Sam.
I'm so tempted to jump in as me, but I know I can't. I have so many opinions on this.
Sam, what do you think is the major flaw in your argument though? What question, and how would you pose that as a question to Tobi?
I think if you say that some people are in more privileged positions than others, and therefore some people's speeches should be more regulated than others in order to kind of create fairness. How do you do that? Like, should the law be imprisoning people, or should people be self-censoring? I mean, you know, it's maybe a nice idea, but it's like, how does it work in practice?
Good question.
And actually, if you could answer it, that'd be really good for me. So that'd be good, you know. In order, I'm just going to use you as my brain.
Good question. I think it's a question for people rather than for governments, and I think in that sense it has to be something that comes from the bottom up rather than top down. I think as soon as you get a situation whereby you're developing laws, for example, I think you start to enter a really tricky area. And I think that actually what you're seeing are slow movements towards people. You know, there are lots of books from people who are talking about these difficult issues which are getting published today, and I think that's a really good thing. And I think actually once you affect the ideology, once you get into universities and you get people thinking the way that you think is best for society, I think that will start to come through. I don't think you need to go about legislating for it. I think it can come from a kind of bottom up ideological approach.
Cool.
I think sounds like Tobi and Sam will agree in all our different points.
That means that, I suppose, that if you both agree, then that means you've both kind of pushed over to Sam's original opinion. I mean, to wrap up, is that accurate?
Not sure, because I've
what have you taken from this?
I think
Are we back to being who we
But
are?
be yourself.
Okay.
Say what you really think.
Say what you really think. Finally,
first I don't like Sam.
Yeah. I hated my minute as Toby.
I think it's tricky. I think, look, I think the practical point is a really big issue.
I think that's where, yeah.
And even arguing for you, I'm not sure if I was convincing in that. But I do appreciate that if you have an injustice, then it's arguable that any steps you take towards bringing about justice are good. I think that is a position which is shaky over time, because I think that today that might seem great. What happens in 50 years if people think differently? I think that's where I struggle with it. But I don't think there's no value to it, and I was able to argue it.
It's also interesting because we've all kind of agreed on the fact that we don't really say what we really think in today's society as well. So whether or not that self-censorship exists already in that form, or perhaps we self-censor in another way, it's a debate for another time. But that's another part to the conversation. What do you think? So just to wrap up,
I think we agreed that actually I thought Toby answered very well as me. Like I thought really difficult question. I think that we both agreed that putting the position where the state is kind of trying to legislate speech is very dangerous and infringes on rights, and we didn't really kind of get into we kind of touched on it briefly about kind of how you infringe on rights in different ways. I think I was pretty I agree. I think just by saying that, basically my point is that once you acknowledge that free speech privileges certain people, you're able to affect social change about it. So it's not really to do with me saying what we need to get rid of is free speech. It's to say this thing you view as a kind of perfect democratic ideal, as neutral, as basically a pure good, actually is more nuanced than that. And once you recognise that, we don't need to change free speech. We just need to change what we think about it, and actually to have people realise, actually, even though I can say that, should I? And I think that's really what I would say.
Okay, interesting. That's been a great, an interesting conversation for me, and I hope everyone else has got something out of that.